Okay, so there are certain characteristics that all living things have in common, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So you want to open your Google Keep notebook on a separate tab, and you can go ahead and take notes along with my lecture. You can also alternately take notes on paper. I'm really old, so I like paper a lot, and then transfer main points to Google Keep. It's up to you. If you've previously arranged with me to do so, you can keep all your notes on paper, but those need to be really detailed and organized, and you'll have to provide regular proof of that to me as well. So you can contact me if you have any questions about that. But let's talk about what all living things have in common. First, all living things are organized. And what I mean by that is that they're made of repeating units of organization known as cells. But to be clear, all living things aren't made of cells. All living things are made of at least one cell. So that's a pretty important distinction. And you'll want to thank it in your notes. So they're made of at least one cell. So organisms fall into two general categories based on the number of cells that compose them. They're either unicellular, which means that they are made of one cell, or they're multicellular. Unicellular organisms are relatively simple. That doesn't mean that they're easy to learn about. Well, I think you'll become very familiar with that later. But they do all of the life processes that they carry out, they're doing it all in one cell. We'll talk about how those life processes are accomplished tomorrow, but for now I think it's important just that you have a general idea of some examples of characteristics of organisms, or some examples, of organisms that just have one cell. And you're probably really familiar with bacteria. Bacteria are incredibly small. They're prokaryotic, which means that their cells don't have a true nucleus. And they make up a good bit of the diversity of living things on the planet. We'll talk about that more when we do classification. But I want to give you some alternate unicellular organisms, because I think bacteria are always kind of used as the poster organism for unicellular creatures. But there are certainly other examples. So there are some unicellular protists, for example, Volvox, which is a photosynthetic, eukaryotic, unicellular organism. And there's also a unicellular fungus that you're probably very familiar with, and that is yeast. So these organisms are made of just one cell. They carry out all of the processes of living things with just one functional unit. Multicellular organisms are probably a little more familiar with you. You are probably more familiar with them, and that's because they include you. So multicellular organisms, examples are going to include animals, that includes humans, plants, and then lots of protists and fungi as well, for example, mushrooms, which are fungi, and algae. A lot of algae anyway, is multicellular. So in your notes, what should you write? Should you just write all living things have a cell? No, you should probably be more specific. So you have your notes in Google Keep, you have your notes at home, you can use your notes on assessments. It's really important that you write as much detail as you can. So you should have all of this in your notes. I would even go as far as to draw pictures, underline, use color. You can do all of that online with Google Keep, and you can also do that at home in your own paper notebook. So that is one of 7 characteristics of life that we're going to talk about today. In addition to being organized, all living things respond to stimuli. So stimulus is going to be anything that elicits a response from an organism. You may may easily be able to recognize this in an animal. But what about a plant or bacteria? What do they respond to? Well, I'm going to give you some examples. So with single-celled organisms, for example, we have movement in response to chemicals or movement in response to light. So if you take, for example, a photosynthetic bacterium and you put them in the light, oftentimes they're going to move towards where the source of light energy is the highest. Plants, in addition, move towards the light. That's called a tropism. Phototropism is when plants move in response to the light. So plants often turn their leaves or their shoots towards the light so they can get more energy for photosynthesis. Plants also move in response to gravity. Shoots grow up, roots grow down. How do they know where up and down are? We'll talk about that later. Stigmatropism is plants' movement in response to touch. So if you have houseplants at home and you touch them a lot, you probably notice they don't grow very well. Often plants grow away from touch. Tendrils or vines, for example, that grow around a lamppost, a mailbox, a fence, they use touch to figure out where they can and cannot grow. So even though you may not startle a plant and jump back, for example, that may be your traditional idea of what responding to a stimulus is. Even single-celled organisms and plants do respond to stimuli. It's a characteristic of all living things. All living things maintain a constant internal environment. That is called homeostasis. We'll hear this word a lot this year. Stasis means the state of. Homeo means the same. Organisms like to keep their internal environment constant, and that's going to include temperature, pH, salinity, all of those things, and many more. Salinity is saltiness, by the way. Organisms want to keep exactly constant. Your temperature inside of your body is always 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And what happens if it goes up a degree or 2 or 3? We start to get worried because a change in temperature that is greater than a few degrees can mean death. Same with pH, same with salinity, and we'll talk about those as we go through the year. Now, all organisms like to maintain homeostasis, but we all have different ways of doing so. In a really complex multicellular organism, such as an animal, a human, for example, we have some really complex biochemical feedback loops that help us to do this. We also have behavioral adaptations to help us maintain homeostasis. Some really good examples, let's just go with humans for example, to maintain temperature. If we start to get hot, we start to sweat. Water on the surface of our skin evaporates, and that causes what's called evaporative cooling. That cools the surface of our skin. Unless you live in Charlotte, North Carolina, where it's really humid, and I think right now it's probably about 85% humidity outside, meaning the water doesn't leave the surface of your skin, meaning you're not cool, you're just wet and hot, which is terrible. But usually, sweating allows for evaporative cooling. that's going to cause your body temperature to decrease. Now, if it decreases too much, you're going to get cold. Your body doesn't like it to be too hot, and your body doesn't like it to be too cold either. So what's going to happen when your body gets too cold, if your temperature dips below 98.6, is that your body's going to try to generate heat. So right now, can you rub your hands together as fast as you can? You'll start to feel that your hands are getting warm, right? That warmth is caused by friction. Inside of your body, your muscles do the same thing. So they start to generate friction by moving back and forth, and that's called shivering, right? So we shiver. Shivering creates friction, which creates heat, and our body temperature is going to rise. So by alternating between sweating and shivering, our body can maintain a constant internal temperature. And that's an example of our body maintaining homeostasis. Let's look at another example, a really important one. I know I'm erasing these fast, but I'm hoping you can hit pause if you need to wait to copy. So if you know anybody in your family with diabetes, or if you have diabetes, then you know that your body is very particular about blood sugar levels. And the sugar that's in your blood is called glucose. It's a simple sugar. You'll learn a lot about it, so I'm just going to go ahead and introduce it now. So let's say that you eat a Snickers bar. Your blood sugar is going to go up immediately. When your blood sugar goes up, your body recognizes that you're not maintaining homeostasis. It needs to lower that blood sugar to an acceptable amount. So in a normal functioning human body, what's going to happen when your blood sugar goes up is that your body is going to release a hormone called insulin. Insulin's really important, which is why we're going to bring it up now. So insulin is released from the pancreas of your body. And when insulin is released, it tells the sugar in your blood to be taken up by muscles that can use it or by storage. So for example, you store a lot of glucose in your liver. So what's going to happen immediately is it's going to cause the cells in your body to take up that sugar, and your sugar level is going to drop. If your insulin is too high, which doesn't happen too often, but does in some metabolic circumstances, or more than likely when this situation occurs, you just haven't eaten in a long time. So let's say you eat breakfast, you're sitting in class, waiting around 4 or 5 hours until you eat lunch, you start to get really hungry, your blood sugar is really low. When your blood sugar is really low, that's also a problem because your body uses sugar for energy. So in order to maintain a constant internal sugar concentration, your body is going to release what's called glucagon. Glucagon is also an important hormone, and it's one that's not necessarily known as much as insulin, but glucagon requires your cells to release glucose. So in your muscle cells, in your liver, where glucose is stored as glycogen, we'll talk about that later, glucose is going to be required to be released. And when that happens, your blood sugar goes back up. So this is another example of the way your body is maintaining a constant internal environment. It does all of this, hopefully, without you having any input whatsoever, which is awesome. If things start to go out of whack, if your body doesn't produce enough insulin, for example, or if your body stops being responsive to insulin, then you get into a situation where you'll either need to take insulin shots, like if you have type 1 diabetes, or you may have to just regulate the food that you eat because your body doesn't respond to its own insulin anymore. That's type 2 diabetes. So there are certainly situations where homeostasis gets out of whack, but your body's natural ability, your body's natural process is to try to regulate these concentrations on its own. So that's number 3. Number 4, all living things utilize energy. So using energy, and there are 2 different ways that organisms can get the energy they need. Organisms are either autotrophic or heterotrophic. Auto means self. Troph means to feed. Hetero means other. So if you're autotrophic, that means you're self-feeding. And I don't mean like you make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I mean what's happening is that you as an organism can create your own food. Unfortunately, humans can't do that. But plants can, right? So these organisms utilize light energy, in other words, the sun, in order to create chemical energy. Glucose. They make their own food. A great example, I want to write this where you can't see it, are plants. And also algae. Heterotrophs are different. Heterotrophs must take in their chemical energy from another source. You can think of this as eating. These organisms have to eat in some way. So animals are clearly heterotrophic. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, humans and other animals must eat regularly, although at different intervals depending on the animal, in order to survive. We can't make our own food. So all living things utilize energy, but they don't get it the same way. Plants can use the sunlight to make their own sugar. Animals and other heterotrophs must actually eat the sugar, the food that other organisms have made in order to survive. That's really important. That's number 4. Number 5, all living things reproduce. They make babies. Now, you may be thinking, I'm not reproducing, Ms. Reborn, I'm living. Well, that's technically true, but you probably have the ability to reproduce. Although, not all living things have the ability to reproduce, right? Some humans have trouble with fertility and they can't actually create offspring. Does that mean that they're not living? No, they're just anomalies. And I'm just going to introduce that word here because we'll see a lot of those with the characteristic of life. I'm going to write it here. An anomaly is an exception to the rule that doesn't change the rule. So if you're, for example, a 45-year-old male and you can't have children, that doesn't mean that you're not living. You're just an exception to the rule that all living things reproduce, but you don't really change the rule. Statistically, that infertility is insignificant with respect to the species. I hope that makes sense. Another example is a mule, right? A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. You may not know this, but mules are sterile. They actually can't have any offspring. But mules are very much living things. Just because of the way that they're produced, they can't actually have offspring. Mules are an anomaly. But let's talk about the way that things reproduce. Because when I say reproduce, you're probably thinking in terms of sex. Sexual reproduction is how animals mostly reproduce. But there are a lot of other ways that organisms can reproduce. So let's talk about 2 general categories. Organisms can reproduce asexually or sexually. Asexual means that the genes of only one parent are being transferred to the offspring. And while sometimes this is as simple as, for example, yeast that we talked about as unicellular, yeast going through what's called binary fission. That just means splitting into two. The yeast grows and then splits in half. Right? Pretty simple. Asexual reproduction can actually get really complex. So there are some fungi, for example, that undergo fission, which is when a parent fungus starts to grow and a baby fungus grows off of its side. It has the exact same genes as the parent, but once it grows to a certain size, it falls off and grows beside the parent. Kind of weird, but we're talking about like mold, for example. So there's also regular fission. There's also something a little weird called fragmentation, and that is when the parent individual literally blows up into lots of little pieces, and each of those little pieces grows up to be a fully functional adult. Now, you may think this sounds a little strange, and it would be for humans, although it would be really cool if we could do this. But some animals go through fragmentation. For example, planarians. I'll do my best. You'll see I'm not a great artist. Planarians are tiny little worms that have crossed eyes, and they look sort of like this. Now, planarians actually can have sex, so they can have a reproductive process that includes two parents. But sometimes when the environment is stressful, like they live in ponds, sometimes it's cold, they can't find a mate, they're really stressed out, they need to reproduce, the winter is coming. What they'll do is they'll undergo fragmentation. So they alter the turgor pressure in their cells to essentially explode. So they're going to tear themselves into bits, and then each little bit is going to grow into a new worm. And if you'll excuse my artistic ability, these worms will all grow to be fully functioning adults. Now, the issue with asexual, and I'll write that, that's fragmentation. There's a problem with asexual reproduction, evolutionarily speaking, and that is that the offspring are going to have the same genes as the parent. They're going to have the same genetic composition. That means if there's a disease or some other environmental factor that affects the offspring, if it affects one, it's probably going to affect all. This can be really dangerous for the species. So species that only reproduce asexually really need to have another means of getting genetic variety. We'll talk about that later. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is really useful because it combines and shuffles the genes of two parents, which means that offspring or babies don't necessarily have the exact traits of either one of their parents. This means that you're constantly making new combinations so that no individuals are the same. So if a disease or an environmental factor affects one offspring, it may not necessarily affect others or the parents. This is really helpful evolutionarily. So I'm going to maybe make a note here. Hopefully that'll make sense after that explanation. This is going to create more genetic variety, whereas asexual reproduction is going to make what are called clones. Clones may sound like a scary Star Wars episode, but really clone just means genetically identical. So these are the two ways that organisms can reproduce. Some organisms only reproduce asexually. Some organisms only reproduce sexually. Some organisms can alternate between the two, and we'll talk about that whole variety as we go through this particular semester. All right, so that's number 5. Number 6. Oh, do that one. I had to check my notes. Number 6. All living things grow, but we don't just grow, right? Because when you're born and when you're a toddler, your head is like a third of the size of your body. We don't just get big. We don't walk around looking like big babies. Our bodies change, right? Our proportions change. Our organs change. In humans, for example, we go through a really critical period called puberty, in which our bodies are significantly different after. In insects, there's a process called metamorphosis that occurs in which the post-metamorphosis body is completely different sometimes than the pre-metamorphosis body. So this isn't just simple growth. This isn't just expanding. This is changing. And so I want to add to this that all living things not only grow, but they also develop. Grow and develop. Now, growth is going to take simple cell division. And there's a word from that, you probably remember it from the 8th grade, called mitosis. This is going to cause expansion of the organism. It's going to cause the organism to physically get bigger. But development is different. Development is caused by something called cell differentiation or cell specialization. And those are two big words, but you really do need to know them both. I'm going to use specialization here. It's so big it goes out of your field of view. Okay, cell specialization. That means that cells don't just make more of themselves. They don't just clone, but they start to create offspring cells that have different functions. Think about your body. You don't just have one type of cell. You have skin cells, you have heart cells, you have nerve cells. You have cells that have different functions. Now, they all have the same DNA, but they're specialized. They've developed, they've changed so that they can accomplish a particular task. So I want you to keep that in mind, that we don't just get bigger, but we also change. And I'm going to write that second word, differentiation, underneath, just so that you can keep that in mind. Now, this happens in utero when a zygote, which is the first cell that is created when sperm fertilizes the egg. When a zygote goes from 1 cell to 2, from 2 cells to 4, from 4 cells to 8, specialization is already occurring. Then you have organogenesis, where you're forming the organs, you're forming the polarity, the axes of the body, determining where your arms go, where your legs go, where your mouth is, where your anus is. All of that is cell specialization. But then again, I also want to remind you that there are big changes that happen during the lifespan of an organism, such as metamorphosis and puberty. So I'm going to write those here just so you don't forget. And so you should write them too. So all living things grow and develop. And so we have one more, and it's really important. Number 7. Is that all living things adapt and evolve. Now, at first glance, these words may seem the same, right? Because I think in casual conversation, we use the word evolve to mean like some sort of a change that occurs in a relatively short amount of time. But that's actually not what it means biologically, so we want to be really careful about that. An adaptation can be short-term or long-term. If you go outside and it's cold and you put on a coat, that's a behavioral adaptation. That's really short-term, right? But organisms, for example, that live in really cold environments, developing thicker fur over time, that's something a little different. So that's an adaptation that has come about over a long period of select. When I say long, I mean many, many generations of selective pressure from the environment on an already existing variation in a gene pool. And that may be a little tricky for you to wrap your head around yet, but we're going to talk about it a lot when we talk about evolution. But that's what we mean by evolve. So just to be clear, we are talking about changes here, but we're talking about changes biologically that are occurring over an extremely long period of time. So just to be very clear, genetic changes, not in one organism, like one organism goes outside and puts on a coat, or one organism spontaneously develops a mutation that causes some weird, like, skin thickening. Not in one organism, but genetic changes in a population, so in a group of organisms, the same species, in the same geographical area, over time. And we mean a long time. So tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years in the case of some species, quicker in organisms that reproduce quicker, like in bacteria. But this is what we mean by evolution and evolutionary adaptations. So if you're looking at, for example, the beak of a hummingbird, that adaptation, that small, thin, specialized beak that pulls nectar perfectly out of the flowers that the hummingbird regularly visits, that is an adaptation that didn't come from an organism making its mind up to do something different. It didn't come from one organism deciding that it needed the change. It also didn't come from the population needing the change. There was some existing variation in the environment, the availability of nectar in these particular flowers, selected for the birds that had longer beaks. So that is a really fine point. It's really easy to understand, but it's also easy to misunderstand. We're going to talk a lot about evolution as we go through the semester, and I think you'll understand it a lot more. But for now, number 7, all living things adapt and evolve. So you're going to have some quizzes as you go through this unit, just these first 4 days, this introductory unit, that talk about and require you to bring up some information that we've discussed here today. All of your lectures won't look like this, but I really like to write because I think that it helps for you to see the information written, and sometimes PowerPoints can get a little mundane. So make sure that you've listened, that you've taken down your notes, and that you send them to me via Google Keep or prearranged paper notebook documentation, and I will talk to you soon. We'll have our next lesson on how these living things that have these characteristics accomplish life processes tomorrow.